regions. In a way, Ireland has been an extraordinary economic laboratory. So you have two people on the one island, more or less the same people. It's what Freud would call the narcissism of small differences. Okay, I remember bringing an Argentinian friend of myself up to Belfast recently, and I think you've met him, Martin Lestow, friend of mine. Yeah, and he was looking at Falls Road and the Shankill, and we took him across Lower Newtownards Road and la la la. And his view as an Argentinian was, you know, the differences when you actually take an altitude are quite small, right? And I thought it was a fair point to make. But if you look at the country, if you look at our history, if you look at the economic opportunities, what you have is a laboratory, Martina, right? So Irish people in one jurisdiction do really badly, Irish people in the other jurisdiction do really well. What's the problem? The jurisdiction, not the people. Right? Think about it. Like, this is so obvious to me. It's so self-evident to me. Like, if economists could have run an economic experiment, partition would have been it. Okay? And they would have said, now, here's the same people. One crowd were rich, one crowd were poor. More or less the same people. Okay? Right? Differences of culture and religion, but in effect, more or less the same people. And what we're going to do is we're going to divide a little line, and we're going to have one jurisdiction and one way of doing things up here, and one way of doing things down here. And let's see what happens. So for the first 25 years, it's like, oh, okay, it's more or less accords to the way we thought. The Northeast is still better off. The Southwest, kind of disastrous. But then over decades and decades and decades, you see this is like an experiment. And we end up 100 years after partition with the evidence. And the evidence is overwhelming that the people in the northeast of the country under one jurisdiction have done profoundly worse economically than the people in the other jurisdiction. And you draw your conclusions. And the conclusions have to be that it's something to do with the jurisdiction, not with the people. You can't blame the people for this. It's got something to do with the jurisdiction. Economically, partition has been a total disaster for everyone in the northeast of the country. Everyone. Nationalists, unionists, whatever tribe you decide that to hang your colours on. It's been an economic disaster.
Why would you say that? Not everybody would agree with that. You know, people feel an allegiance to Britain.
Well, the evidence is overwhelming. In fact, it's overwhelming for all centralised regions of the British state, Scotland, Wales, etc. Basically, what you've seen is the over-centralisation of the UK in London has led to the gradual erosion and then quite rapid erosion of the economic competences of the regions, whether it's Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Okay, but let's come back to the northeast of Ireland in the late 19th century. Extraordinarily innovative place. Almost like the Silicon Valley of Europe. Huge innovation.
At the time of partition, the North was a powerhouse.
This is my point.
It was the agricultural republic was going to drag it down.
Exactly. So this is my point. So at the time of partition, so we take the late 19th century, early 20th century, that part of Ireland, the northeast of Ireland, was by far the wealthiest, by far the most innovative, by far the only industrial power. In fact, the southern economy we could describe as a beer and biscuits economy, that the only industry we had was the off products of agriculture, biscuits from Jacobs and beer from Guinness's. There was no other industry here. So had you placed a bet 100 years ago on the day of partition, your bet would have said the following: the northern economy would continue to be a small microcosm of modernity. The southern economy would languish as almost, as you said, an agricultural economy, but an economy that bled its people because of a lack of capital. And those people would have to emigrate. And that was the story from the famine on. And in fact, that was the story up until the 1970s. The southern economy was backward, okay? But the interesting thing, the southern economy turned around. Think about the north, right? The north now is an economic backwater in comparison to the south, okay, on every single metric, not just on income, not just in innovation, not just in startups, not just every single metric, okay? And the reason, I believe, is partition. And because partition robbed the North of its normal hinterland, first of all, number one. And number two, it created a dependency culture, which is very, very evident in the way in which Northern Ireland runs its economy. Far too
unsuccessful for the first decades of partition. It only
it was successful. It was successful. It's quite an interesting thing. Northern Ireland could pay for itself in the British Exchequer until the 1940s.
Okay.
Right? It actually had a surplus. So that's quite interesting. So there was a surplus of cash going from Northern Ireland to London up until the 1940s. Akin with the rest of the United Kingdom after the Second World War, I don't know who it was, Britain's an empire looking for a future, or it's forgotten its empire, doesn't know its place. The Northern Irish economy has, like the rest of the British economy, absent London, the British economy is very backward. And I mean that you can engage that in a variety of ways in terms of trade, what it makes, what it doesn't make, etc. So Northern Ireland suffered profoundly by not having its own autonomy. That's the key. So what actually happens in economics is if you have a bond market, Martina, if you have to go out and raise money on your own, with your own flag, with your own risk premium as a country, you mature very quickly, okay? Because you have to get your house in order.
Skin in the game.
Precisely. So if you don't have that, if you're a dependent, if you're like a concubine economy, okay, right? You don't need to actually get up in the morning and say, what are we going to do today, right? So consequently, politics and economics in the North has been diminished to simply a game of who can extract more money out of the exchequer, right? Now, what that does is over 2 or 3 generations, in the first generation or two, that's fine, because it's an easy life. But what actually happens is the rest of the world is moving on, Martina. Nobody's waiting for Northern Ireland to wake up. And the same way in Britain. Nobody's waiting for Brexit. Nobody cares. I traveled before COVID a lot, giving speeches. Brexit is very, very low on the rest of the world's list of priorities. It's kind of it's like an idiosyncratic, almost slightly British weirdness. And I'm not talking about France and Germany. I'm talking about when you go to the English-speaking world, you go to Canada, America, South Africa, Australia. It's like, yeah, get on with it, man. It's not our deal, right? So the world is not waiting for any country. Every country has to figure out how they play the game of competitive economics in a globalized world, okay? The Republic of Ireland, because we had our backs against the wall, because we had no capital, because nobody would lend money to us, we had to think, okay, what are we going to do? How do we leapfrog this backwardness into the future? And what we did was join the European Union, and committedly. And I talk as somebody who worked as an economist in the Central Bank of Ireland. I had a few proper jobs years ago, Martina, before we started this other existence. But we'd go and I went to various meetings with the governor. We'd go, and Ireland it was a commitment on the part of the civil servants that this was important to us. Now I was very young. I was only the bag carrier, and it's because I'd gone to university doing a postgrad in Belgium that I could actually speak foreign languages, which was unusual in Ireland at the time in the early 90s. So I went along almost as like the government saying, what are they saying? What are those Germans saying? What are those French saying? Anyway, the point was we were committed. But the main difference, I believe, was the presence of American multinationals, our openness to the United States, which was part of an economic strategy, Martina, but also part of a legacy of the diaspora. And I really believe this, that soft power is unbelievably important. I think those two things, the European Union and the Americans, now this is what the British don't understand, is that Ireland has been playing this game for a long time, which is, and all small countries have to figure this out. How do you play off the big countries? How do you be part of the European Union, be attractive to Americans, and be cognizant of the fact that Britain is a significant trade partner? But I'll give you a statistic that shows a diversion of trade. When Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England, Britain, for the second time in the late 1940s, I think early 1950s. Early 1950s, he got a second.
He stepped down by 51, didn't he?
He got a second bite of the cherry, I think, right? Yeah. Irish trade to the Irish exports to Britain were 92% of our exports, 93% of our exports went to the UK. Today, it's 11%. So just think about the change in the economy. the Irish economy was hyper dependent on Britain in the 50s. In the Brexiteer epoch that they keep going back to, right? And they still think of the 1950s, right? Okay, as some sort of great beer and warm beer and cricket, all that carry on, right? All that malarkey, and it's only malarkey, right? 9 out of 10 Irish exports went to Britain. Now 1 out of 10 Irish exports go to Britain. Okay, so our economy has changed dramatically. So in a way, and this goes back to Northern Ireland, Britain has remained static. It hasn't dealt with the world as an economic entity. If you take London out of the equation, the financial markets, rock and roll, advertising, maybe the Premier League is another big British brand, right? If you take those out, what you're talking about is a country that has gone backward economically. And unfortunately, Northern Ireland, as an umbilical link to Britain, has been dragged back. So, for example, when I was a kid, Martina, and you'll remember this, I remember going to play a rugby match for the school I was going to, secondary school, in Campbell College, and I'd never been in the North before, okay? And it was in the early 1980s, a little schoolboy team. And we went across the border, and going across the border was like going into a modern country. The roads were better, the cars were better, the sweets were better. I remember everything looked really different, okay? I was thinking, man, this is all cool. And of course, now, when my in-laws have a caravan, which is, I've noticed is a very northern thing to have, is a caravan, and they come down the south, and they come to Athlone all the time. They come down from Belfast, they come down, and they're always saying, you know, the roads are better, the cars are better, the standard of living is better. So what we've seen in our lifetime, Martina, is a shift in terms of lifestyle and living standards and whatever, right? And so my sense is that the opportunity for Northern Ireland in the context of a united island economy, okay, are enormous. If you think about income per head, for example, at the moment, the income per head in Northern Ireland is about 24,000 euros per year. Mm-hmm. And in the Republic, it's 40,000 euros a year. And that's not on GDP, that's something called GNI, which strips out all these distortions. So,
okay, but David, just before you move on from that, it's not just income, it's about disposable income. So are there supports perhaps in the North? I'm thinking of the NHS, for example, the education system, not at university level, but up until that, where perhaps people in the North are better off.
I think the NHS suffers quite dramatically. I think there's a lot of propaganda about the NHS. If you look at when I listen to people clapping for the NHS, right? And the idea that the NHS is by far and away the best health service in the world, there's very little evidence of that. So I'll tell you, for example, my mother-in-law is waiting for a steroid injection. She's 83. She's waiting for a steroid injection into her hip, okay? Because she's got arthritis. In East Belfast, right? She's been waiting for months. That doesn't happen in the South. My sense...
Could you pay to jump the queue,
because people don't pay to jump the queue. People pay insurance, like the Germans. The idea of health insurance is totally normal. There's a myth abroad, okay, that paying health insurance is abnormal. In fact, it's the way the vast majority of European health systems work. The NHS is an outlier. So in the NHS, you all wait together. That's not necessarily my sense, right? If you look at, for example, unemployment benefit in the North, right, vis-a-vis the South, the dole in the South is 185 euros a week. In the North, it's about 58 pounds. I mean, it's, you know, to be poor in the North is a disaster in comparison to the South, okay? The Southern welfare state is much more generous, much, much more generous, and has been for a long time. So this idea that, in fact, there's a nasty, red and tooth and claw capitalist country in the South that doesn't look after its people, just try being unemployed in either jurisdictions, okay? So my sense is that, and the reason is because the welfare state of a country has to reflect the income of the country. And if you can generate decent incomes and generate decent wealth, and you and I live down here, Martina, so we know what's going on. This is not a Panglossian world. But what you do understand is that on most metrics, living in the Republic of Ireland provides you with better opportunity, okay? That's the first thing. Now, let's see what happens after COVID. COVID is a big, big, big issue. and it's going to be hard to recover, and let's see how that recovery goes, okay? But if you look at these three big things, one is that partition. At partition, the North was twice as rich as the South. It's now twice as poor, okay? Number one. The North had dynamic, outward-looking companies that traded all over the world. It now has very few, okay? The South has managed to bring capital in, and that capital is fused and driven together an economy that is, I would say, one of the more interesting economic test cases that we've seen in many years. Even the education system in the North is very unusual because the North has the most spectacular results and the most spectacular failures in the UK. So if you're good in the North, you do extremely well, okay? But if you're bad in the North, if you're actually falling behind, you fall behind profoundly. So it's actually an extreme outcome for an education system. But let's think about the opportunity. Imagine that the North now was a bit like the South in about 1992, 93, in terms of the economy. So the question is, what is the best roadmap for Northern Ireland? It strikes me is becoming much more akin to ourselves, much more like ourselves. And if that involves reunification politically, or even just movements towards a united Ireland economically, I think the North has everything to gain and almost zero to lose, almost zero to lose. And if you take your observation about Brexit, if the dynamic of British politics is profoundly derailed by Scottish nationalism, okay, then the union of Britain, Wales, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland looks very unusual. It looks like an anomaly. The UK will have to deal with its own internal inconsistencies. And England will have to deal with what England is and how England defines itself. If you think about the British project started in Laois and Offaly in the Tudor times, okay? That all powerful countries demand of themselves that they project their power as far away from their capital as possible, which is why big, powerful countries colonize other countries. So the British project started in Laois and Offaly under the Tudors. That was the first colony. Then you had the Ulster colonization around the same time. Okay? This was an experiment in colonialism. At a certain stage, when our parents were born, that colonial project dominated half of the world. Kind of crazy to think about it. And now, as that project recedes back, it will recede back to the Tudors. It'll go back to where it was in the late or mid-16th century. Seriously. And it will be England, and that's it. And then that England has to figure out its place in the world, and it will. And it might take a huge social revolution there, much greater than anything we're talking about, actually. And Scotland will find its way, because that's what independence does. Because remember we said at the start, having your own bond market makes an adult out of you, right? You got to wake up in the morning and figure out, how do I make a crust?